Hello, Jimmy here, and you are probably watching this video around the time that the new Pope is being elected. This video is going to go out on the second day of the Conclave, when probably we're going to get some white smoke to tell us who is going to be the next leader of the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm going to raise my tripod up just ever so slightly. Now today we're used to the Pope being the head of the Catholic Church, and also weighing in on subjects that are usually relevant to majority Catholic countries or humanitarian efforts, so saying things like, is divorce permissible? Are contraceptives something that we can use? Could we all please stop killing each other and the planet for 10 minutes so that we can have a little sit down and a chat for a change? That sort of thing. But in the medieval period, the Pope was something very different in the makeup of Europe, politically and spiritually. So let's talk about some fun medieval popery. When this video comes out, 133, I think, cardinals are voting on who is going to be the next pope. It's a completely closed process. The food is restricted so that you can't sneak messages in and that sort of thing. It's a very highly controlled, very private process. But the first pope who was elected solely by cardinals was Pope Alexander II, and he is the Pope who authorised the Norman invasion of England under William, Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, in 1066. And basically William wrote to the Pope and said, please can I invade England so that I can bring the old English Church in line with the Roman Catholic Church, and that means that the Pope will then have more influence on who becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, who becomes a bishop there, and that kind of thing. Traditionally, the Archbishop comes to Rome to get the pallium, to get the vestments from the Pope himself, and then goes back to be Archbishop of Canterbury. This is, of course, when Archbishop of Canterbury was a Catholic position. The ABC is now the head, second in command of the Church of England under the reigning monarch, of course. So, mentioning the Old English Church, one of the reasons that the Norman invasion of England and Great Britain and Ireland and other places gets papal support is because the idea is to bring these countries in line with Rome. Although these are already Christian countries, like Anglo-Saxon England in the 11th century was solidly a Christian country, they weren't following Roman rules necessarily. And one of the great examples of this in Great Britain is Welsh bishops, so places like Bangor, where I'm from, the Bishop of Bangor, notoriously left his diocese to his son, and it just became hereditary. So hereditary dioceses were becoming a thing in certain places, and that was just seen as how it worked. If you do that for 300 years, it just becomes the way that it's done, right? And that's not in line with how it works. That is not the Roman Catholic practice. So the Roman practice had to be drilled into people, and the Pope saw the Norman invasion as a handy tool for exerting Roman power and the Roman way of Catholicism in Great Britain. So the papal banner is taken into battle with Bishop Odo and William the Conqueror. In fact, on the Bayeux tapestry there's a pair of keys dangling from a spearhead, which I think might be a slightly quaint misinterpretation, because I'm not 100% convinced that they would have just had keys dangling from spears, and I think it's more likely to have been a banner with the keys of St. Peter, but I do love the idea that Normans were going into battle with just a big pair of keys rattling on the end of a spear shaft. That's great fun. Yeah, if that's something that anybody has a good source on, I'd love to read that, because I would love to have a Norman impression in my reenactment where I have a pair of keys. That would be lovely. But yeah, so the Normans of the 11th and 12th century kind of become almost this military wing of the papacy, where popes frequently appeal to Norman kings and princes and dukes and say, hey, I'm having trouble with XYZ, any chance you could send a detachment of knights my way, and we will grant you spiritual rewards and great influence in return for, ABC type of help. But before Alexander II authorised the Norman conquest, before he gave William the OK to do basically a trial run at a crusade, right? Because after this, popes used the idea of telling French knights to go and fight non-Christians and people who weren't Roman Catholics as a good way of stopping them from fighting each other and potentially the Pope. This was a handy trial run for that. Before that, popes were elected in a slightly different way. Popes tended to be elected in a way that involved cardinals, but also involved other Roman clergy. It was also sort of reminiscent of the way that Roman emperors and Roman consuls were elected, where the people of Rome would also have a bit of a say, usually en masse, usually in the streets, and usually in a way that said, vote for the guy we like, or we'll start burning palaces down. And also the Holy Roman Emperor, the Emperor of the Romans, had an influence. And to kind of make sense of this, we have to go right the way back to 800. So in AD 800, Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, King of the Franks, is declared Emperor of the Romans. He is made Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. So Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. And that's quite an astute move on the part of Leo. If you crown somebody as Emperor of the Romans, you do a number of things. The Emperor gets the title Emperor, which is conferred on him by the Pope, which means that the head of the church, God's mouthpiece on earth, has declared you rightful leader of an empire. That means that you are very much the legitimate leader of your country. Basically, no Catholic in your country no Christian in your country is going to go against you being the emperor, because the Pope says you're emperor. If the Pope says you're emperor, God says you're emperor. Who am I going to go? Am I going to go against God? No, of course not. I'm going to pay obeisance to the emperor. I don't like the guy, but it's God's will. You, as a citizen of that country, know that the leader of your country is pretty damn secure because the Pope made him emperor. So you get that security. You, as the emperor, also have a degree of political sway. You also have a degree of influence on the way that the Pope works now. The Pope gets the security of having an emperor, which means that he basically has a large, in the case of Charlemagne, well-trained veteran army who obeys Charlemagne, who obeys the Pope, at least in theory. So you, as the Pope, get a loyal ally. You get to reserve this right that you have as well as the head priest, as the Pontifex Maximus, of crowning the emperor. So this is a thing that you get to do. Nobody else gets to do this. You put the crown on the head of the Emperor of the Romans. This is your thing to do. That means that you have political sway. That means that you have military power, hopefully, backing your regime. The Emperor has the legitimacy of the Pope behind him, and has probably a degree of flexibility in terms of invading other Christian countries if he needs to, and that kind of thing. And it was a very beneficial, mutually beneficial arrangement. Unfortunately, Charlemagne, in the 9th century, doesn't live forever. He dies, and his empire goes Alexander the Great. So it gets split amongst his various descendants, and the constituent parts sort of get a little bit infighty, as crumbling empires tend to do, and there's a little bit of a period of not anarchy exactly, but there's a lot of civil war, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of inter and intra-Nicene warfare. So the Pope, meanwhile, basically keeps going through the motions. The next person who is declared Emperor of the Romans is crowned by the Pope. It goes on and on and on. We go through the Louis and Lothair and Arnulf and all that kind of thing. Then we have Louis the Blind. Louis the Blind is King of Italy, Emperor of the Romans. When I say King of Italy, don't think of Italy as Italy now. In this period, Italy is much more of a patchwork of counties and dukedoms and petty kingdoms that are a lot more fluid. So although somebody may be styled King of Italy, half the time they're king of what would now be 2 or 3 Italian provinces, maybe 4. Sicily, who knows? Who knows who is in control of Sicily at any one time? It may be the Normans, it may be an Italian, it may be North Africans, it may be a combination of the three, it may be somebody completely different, it may be the Byzantine Empire, who knows. Byzantine Empire we'll get on to. But basically, at the start of the 10th century, Louis the Blind, who isn't blind until 905, when he loses control of Italy, leaves Italy for a bit, and leaves someone in charge of the garrison. Effectively, he leaves a general as governor, called Theophylact I. And Theophylact I is a Roman nobleman. He is Count of Tusculum, which is a small town in Italy. And Theophylact I realises that as a Frankish general, as a Roman nobleman, and as a very wealthy man, he potentially has a great deal of power that he could be using to influence things like the politics of Rome, which includes the papacy. So Theophylact I, basically over the next 100 years, makes sure that his family decides who's pope. And specifically, he handpicks popes, basically, until he dies, towards the middle of the 10th century. When does Theophylact I die? He dies in... Do we know when he dies? Oh, 925. So, he dies in 925. But for the rest of the 10th century, his family is basically in control. Think of them like the Borgia popes, 500 years later, but on steroids. So, effectively, Theophylact allies with other Italian nobles to make sure that whoever he wants becomes pope. And the first pope that this happens to is Pope Sergius III. So Sergius III becomes pope. During his papacy, Theophylact effectively becomes leader of Rome. He is called the most magnificent duke. He's put in charge of the pope's finances. He's put in charge of distributing titles. He's made Roman consul in 914, which isn't a thing that had happened for a very, very long time. He's made consul, which is basically supreme head of Rome, for a year. You know, res publica. We've got to maintain res publica. But his wife Theodora... Theodora? I'm just going to double check it's Theodora, not Theodosia. Yeah, it's Theodora. His wife Theodora is also called a senatrix, so a female senator, senatrix. His daughter, Marozia, is also later styled a senatrix. Her son becomes pope. He is Pope John the, I think, 9th? There's so many popes. This is another thing about popes. There's so flipping many of them. They've all got like 6 names between them. The 11th. Pope John the 11th is Marozia's son. She is also said to have had an affair with Pope Sergius III, which would be really weird. Her grandson with Alberic I of Spoleto is Pope Benedict VII. Her other grandson with Alberic I of Spoleto, and also through her second husband, Hugh of Italy, don't ask, is Pope John XII. Her great-grandsons are Pope John the 19th and Pope Benedict VIII, and her great-great-grandson is Pope Benedict XI, and that is 100 years after she dies. So the Theophylact dynasty has this huge influence on the popes, and during the period where it's Marozia and Theodora who are influencing things a lot, that is known as the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, or the Dark Century. So the 10th century into the 11th century is known as the Dark Age of the papacy. It's also, rather nastily, known as the pornocracy. Yes, the pornocracy, where sex was in command, where sex was in control, because people, in the period, but also much later on and into the present day, could not comprehend the idea that these women had political influence on the papacy, and therefore must have been sex workers and courtesans and concubines, and doing all of this lascivious stuff to make all of this politicking happen, where in reality it's probably more likely that they were just very politically savvy, that Theodora, as a noblewoman and wife of the Count of Tusculum, a countess in her own right, was a very politically knowledgeable person, gave that political knowledge to Marozia, who then used it to her advantage. She like negotiated her own second marriage in Rome. That is something that only somebody very good at politics could do, especially back then, especially as a woman. So, the pornocracy is this period where the popes are basically members of the Theophylact family. They are sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, great-great-grandsons, etc. of Theophylact I, Count of Tusculum. So one of the interesting popes that I like from the Saeculum Obscurum is Gregory the Ninth. I'm not sure if he actually counts as a Saeculum Obscurum pope, actually, but Gregory the Ninth, his name was Theophylact. Yeah, does that ring any bells? So his name was Theophylact before he took his papal name of Benedict the Ninth. And Benedict the Ninth was the youngest pope because Benedict was 18 when he took the throne. When he was given the papal tiara, he was 18 years old, and he got the gig because his dad, who was absolutely a member of the Theophylact family, bribed the cardinals. So he acquired the throne through bribery. He was 18 years old. A little bit later he decides, actually, you know what? Stuff this, I don't fancy the papacy, this is too much for me. He then gives the papacy to his godfather on the understanding that he gets paid for it. So he is the only pope who has been accused of selling the papacy. He then changed his mind again and became a pope for the second time. So he's been pope twice, youngest pope, only pope to sell the papacy. That is drama. That is papal scandal. That is massive, massive scandal. There are other popes who have committed scandals as well, and one of the ways that you can commit a scandal as a pope is to be overthrown, to be dethroned, overthrown, deposed as pope, and to then be rejected, because then you get to use one of my favourite words in medieval studies, which is anti-pope. And an anti-pope isn't a colour-inverted, evil dimension version of the pope. You are thinking of the nega-pope, right? Very different beast. An anti-pope is a pope who is now considered not to have been a pope. So think about the Roman emperors, where you have legit Roman emperors, Octavian, Constantine, Justinian, and so forth. You then have pretenders, right? People who claimed to be emperor, rose up, and were then put down, and the legit emperor line took control. Or they simply wasn't a legitimate emperor, two people decided that they were emperor, and one of them loses the civil war. Because sometimes that's how it happens. In the papacy, those pretenders are called anti-popes, which I think is just brilliant. And you get anti-popes right the way through the medieval period. There are pretenders, there are popes like Christopher, who is made pope, is then overthrown as pope, but then becomes pope again. Because he didn't really do anything wrong. Sometimes, like Christopher, you are voted in a way that isn't quite right, so there are certain things that aren't done properly, like today, if the Pope were voted in, and it turned out that one of the cardinals wasn't actually a cardinal after all, it was just somebody wearing a nice red coat and hat who happened to wander into St. Peter's, cast a vote. That vote would then be illegitimate, it would be null and void, and they'd have to have another vote. And you might become the Pope again, but they would have to have a revote. Basically, that's the kind of thing that could happen sometimes. Something would happen that meant that, oh no, hang on, your election as Pope isn't legitimate. We have to unpope you, and then we have to repope you. Some popes lost the papacy in war, so some popes, Rome would be marched upon, and then the Pope would be deposed in favour of somebody that the victor wanted. One of the great rivalries in sort of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries is the papacy versus the French, and this is where we get the Avignon papacy, where in the 14th century the Pope moves from Rome in Italy to Avignon in France, basically because the King of France says, I want my guy to be Pope, and I want the Pope in France. And the Pope is in France. The Pope moves to France, the papacy moves to France for the better part of a century. Then, when that political situation died down, the Pope moves back to Rome. So basically what happens is there's a bit of conflict between France and the papacy. Boniface VIII isn't a fan of France. He dies after being arrested by Philip IV of France. So Pope Boniface VIII dies, Pope Benedict XI dies, Philip then pressures the Conclave, right? So he pressures the cardinals to elect his chum, Clement, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, Pope Clement V. He's not called Clement before he's Pope, actually. His name, I think, is Raymond. So Raymond, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, becomes Pope Clement V. Clement refuses to move from France. He's like, I'm not moving to Rome. I live in Bordeaux. I'm staying here. So he moves his court to Avignon. It becomes a papal enclave, so it becomes papal state territory in France, and it's there for the next 67 years. So it's there from 1309 to 1376. And it goes by various names. The Avignon Papacy, the Babylonian captivity is another reference to, obviously, Jewish captivity in Babylon. So 1376 is when the Avignon Papacy ends. There are then a couple of anti-popes after that, and then some more popes go. But basically in 1376, things kind of return to normal for a little bit. But this is the tumultuous nature of the papacy. This is what I'm trying to say, is now we see the Pope as this kind of very staid, very stable thing. An old Catholic man is elected, becomes Pope for a few years, then dies, and then we have another election, another old Catholic man becomes Pope, maybe says a couple of things that some people go about, and then we have another Pope. In the medieval period, the Pope was a wild card. Like, the Pope might ascend the throne and suddenly be like, right, everybody declare war on Liechtenstein. Like, you never know what a medieval Pope is going to do. A medieval Pope might be like, cool, my son's a cardinal now. Like, you can never plan what the Pope might say. So, medieval papacy, very, very tumultuous. And I really enjoy some of these popes. I think some of my favourite popes are popes like Gregory VII, who was the great reformer, Innocent III, who just battered his way through Europe. Urban II I find fascinating because of the connection with the Crusades. So if you've got a favourite pope, let us know in the comments who your favourite pope is, or if you've got some favourite medieval pope drama, give us your favourite medieval pope drama. I bet some of you are fans of the Borgia popes, and I want to know why. So yeah. And the popes in this period aren't just spiritual leaders, as you've probably already guessed. The popes in the medieval period, just like the Pope today, are political leaders. Today, the Pope is the political leader of the Vatican City. Il Vaticano is a very, very small area. It is a teeny tiny little country inside the city of Rome, with its own army, with its own railway, with its own TV and radio stations. However, 800, 900, 1,000, 1,100 years ago, the Pope was the political head of the Papal State, as it was later known. The Papal State, also known as the Patrimony of St. Peter. And the Patrimony of St. Peter is basically this strip of land in the middle. It's there, in Italy. And it gets bigger and it gets smaller over time. It depends on if it's being nibbled away at by other Italian kings and nobles, if the Holy Roman Emperor has decided that they have a claim on part of the Papal State, which they did regularly and tried to invade regularly, which is why the Pope had to ally themselves with different kings and kingdoms regularly. Usually the Franks, and later the French, the Normans, other Italian kingdoms versus the Holy Roman Empire. And it kind of stems from even earlier, when the Byzantine Empire is controlling northern Italy. It's based in Ravenna, and the Pope, as head of the church, emerges as a landowning political leader, a national leader in his own right. When Christianity becomes legal in the 4th century, a lot of the land that had been privately used and privately donated to Christians becomes kind of Christian-owned land. And as the church formalises, that becomes church land. this church land then kind of expands and expands and expands. More and more people give land to the church, they give money to the church, and it becomes the patrimony of St. Peter. It becomes the papal state, and it becomes its own country. Various Italian nobles and kings and princes on the borders of it make claims to it. They stake claims to the papal state over the years, and various times it gets invaded. The Pope has to defend it. It gets shrunk, it gets expanded, little bits appear elsewhere and that sort of thing. But it meant that the Pope had to act as a medieval king. And if you act as a medieval king and you've got a massive army, defending your country isn't too difficult. If you're Charlemagne and you've got huge forces of tens of thousands of highly trained infantry and cavalrymen, job's a good one. If you're the Pope and it's quite difficult for you to defend your land, especially if there's also a king of Italy, which means that you're technically subject to the king of Italy and shouldn't really have your own national army, it can make things a little bit more complicated, and you have to become quite a political animal. So that is partly why in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, the Pope is really heavily involved with European politics. It's not just because the Pope sees himself as having a right to be involved because he is the mouthpiece of God, it's because he needs to be involved. Because if the Pope is to be secure, he has to be seen as legitimate, he has to have support, and he has to know that other European countries will come to his aid. This is the period, especially sort of pre-9th century, pre-10th century, say, where Arab and Islamic raiding is happening a lot. There are North African armies and troops stationing themselves in Italy and raiding traders in Italy, and the Pope needs to start defending against that. So when the Normans start appearing in Sicily, the Normans, these big, heavily armed French dudes, are ideal as a buffer between the papal state and North Africa and some of the southern Italian kingdoms that can get a bit grumpy. But what about the Byzantine Empire, I hear you cry? Well, the Byzantine Empire basically has its plate full. It's got its own things to deal with. They are dealing with religious schisms, political schisms, civil wars, murders and assassinations, warfare, invasions and incursions from the east and the south. They don't have the manpower to defend Italy. They withdraw from Italy pretty darn quickly when the Lombards start hacking away at their territory. So what does the Pope do? The Pope starts making political moves towards the Lombards instead of the Byzantines. And the Pope is still involved with the Byzantine Empire. The Pope still makes bishops and archbishops in the Byzantine Empire. The Pope still has a little bit of a say in terms of the legitimacy of political leaders, even the emperor. Every now and then the Pope will write a letter and say, don't think you're the legitimate emperor, just as a way of trying to sow a little discord, basically. But as time goes on, the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantine Church split further and further and further and further away. In the 11th century, this becomes a great schism. The Great Schism basically is where the Roman Catholic Church and what becomes the Orthodox Church split, and the Pope is no longer involved in the way that the Byzantine Church is run. It just stops being a thing that he's involved with. That means that kind of the emperor and the elders of the Orthodox Church are on their own, and the Pope is on his own. Except, as I mentioned, other people are involved in the papacy. People like Theophylact. The Holy Roman Emperor traditionally got a say in who was going to be Pope. So Charlemagne basically made it a thing. He basically made sure that from now on, the Pope gets to decide who's emperor, but the emperor also gets a vote in who's going to be the next Pope. That's politics. That's just how it works. And that's fine. However, the Pope makes archbishops. Like I said, you go from wherever you are going to be archbishop of to Rome to get your pallium, to get your vestments. In the 11th century, Gregory VII is a great reforming pope and starts to clamp down on some of this stuff. So Gregory starts to clamp down on things like clergy getting married, the 11th century is when celibacy is introduced for priests. Prior to that, it was perfectly common and perfectly reasonable for clergy to get married. You know? Everybody does it. Everyone was doing it. Why should the clergy be any different? Gregory VII says, right, okay, we can't do this. We can't keep having people's families involved in how the church is being run. This has to be a priests-only men's club, basically. So, celibacy for priests is enacted, no marriage for priests, and one of the other big things that he clamps down on is the emperor of the Romans, later called the Holy Roman Emperor, making bishops and archbishops. At this point, it's relatively common, and the emperor sees it as a right for them to make people bishops. Whoever they want, basically, can be an archbishop of somewhere. Obviously, that is not good for the Pope. The Pope wants to be the only person in Europe who is allowed to make somebody an archbishop. An archbishop is a very powerful position in a nation's Catholic Church's organisation. The Archbishop of Canterbury was hugely influential, for example, in England. The ABC was the one who crowns the king, and wasn't actually the one who crowned William the Conqueror because they were having a little bit of infighting at the time, and they decided to give the archbishopric to somebody else because William didn't want it to go to his brother Odo, and anyway. But the point is, Gregory VII basically says, I am the one who knocks, I am the one who makes archbishops, priests are no longer allowed to get married, and I am clamping down on simony, which is basically selling religious services like forgiveness of sins, prayers for the dead, that kind of thing, saying masses. Clamping down on all of that. This is huge. This causes massive ructions, especially with the emperor. The emperors, basically for the next couple of 100 years, really hate the idea that they don't get to decide who's going to be archbishop and who's going to be a bishop in their territory. The Pope, Gregory, also starts tightening the rules on church land. So at this point, church land is kind of owned by the archbishop. Obviously, if the archbishop is put into his place, obviously if the archbishop is decided by the Pope, that's legitimately church land. If the archbishop's given his job by a king or an emperor, he might decide that it's in his best interest to maybe give a little bit of that land to the king, or maybe not give as many of the taxes to the Pope as he's supposed to. All of these things cause ructions, all of these things cause issues, and this is stuff that the Pope has to tighten up. So the 11th century is where we start seeing the Pope and the Catholic Church sort of starting to become the beast that we recognise today, right? Where we have celibate priests, the Pope makes archbishops, all that kind of thing. You don't sell religious ceremonies, you don't sell masses, you don't sell prayers for the dead, that kind of thing. So, at least in theory. See Bérangère for more. Conspiracy theory viewers will get it. So, the 11th century is where we start seeing that. The 13th century, the 12th and 13th centuries, is where we start seeing the Pope really wielding power, right? It's where we start seeing things like the Crusades. And the Crusades start because French knights and nobles keep killing each other. And the papacy basically decides, the Catholic Church sort of says, right, we've had enough of this. If Christians are fighting each other, it might start affecting us. We might start seeing political developments that aren't favourable to the church. We might start seeing the wrong people starting to take power in places. How about we get all of these uppity Frenchmen to go and fight some non-Christians instead, and that way they're out of our hair, they might make some money, and we get to Christianise a little bit of the land of the Bible. Let's go do that. So Pope Urban II, Odo of Châtillon, basically puts out the call for crusaders. He's supported by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos and a huge army of Christians piles southeastward across the Mediterranean, across Greece, across the Byzantine Empire. They retake Jerusalem, and for the next couple of 100 years, that's the kind of useful political. It's almost like a proxy war, but not quite. It's a very useful political focus for the papacy. If something is going a little bit iffy in Europe, you can kind of go, right, we need another crusade. Let's capture Acre. Let's capture somewhere else. Let's try for Alexandria. Like, it's a useful thing you can do as the Pope. If things are starting to look a little bit hairy, you can reduce tensions in Europe by increasing tensions in the Holy Land. So, the Crusades vary in their success. For a little while there, it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty rock solid. However, towards the end of the 12th century, Jerusalem is recaptured by Muslim forces. Pope Innocent III is then takes the throne. Pope Innocent III is generally seen as the most powerful of the medieval popes. He influences basically everywhere in Europe. He has some of the Reconquista in Spain is going on. Some of the Spanish kingdom's vassalage is given to Pope Innocent III. He basically decides who's going to be king of Sicily at one point. He becomes the guardian of an underage king of Sicily, and basically grooms him into who he's going to marry to secure the future Emperor Otto of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, full disclosure, my camera battery died because I was talking about popes so much that I had to charge it up. So, hi from 2 hours in the future. So, where were we? Yeah, we're at the point where Innocent III is a really powerful pope. He's exerting influence. He receives vassalage from some of the Spanish kingdoms. He influences who becomes king of Sicily. He influences Otto IV becoming Holy Roman Emperor. And this era, the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, are kind of the era where the Pope is this supremely influential, powerful European statesman. And that all starts to fall apart a little bit after a couple of hundred years. And by the 15th century, you have people willingly just ignoring the Pope. Henry VIII starts the Church of England, makes himself head of a church in direct defiance of the Pope. We have the Reformation all over Europe kicking off. In particular in the 15th century. There were whisperings of it in the 14th century. In the 15th century, it just explodes. We have people like Martin Luther. We have revolutions, religious revolutions all over Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, Bohemia, places like what is now Czechia. This huge religious upheaval all over Europe. So that by the 16th century, the Pope's power in Europe has been severely limited. So places like Spain, France, Italy, you still have very, very good papal influence and tight papal control on a lot of the way people live their lives. Places like Great Britain, some parts of the Empire and what becomes Germany, Eastern Europe, and obviously already the Eastern Mediterranean, there's way less papal influence, there's way less Roman Catholic influence. Going into the modern era, obviously that wanes and wanes and wanes and wanes, and the emergence of republics and democracies damages that even further with the separation of church and state. So, the Pope has been a very, very different beast in the past to what it is today, the papacy. I guess now the Pope is considered kind of a slightly parochial voice of calm wisdom and maybe seen as a sort of diplomatic role more than a leadership role in many ways. You know, I'm kind of thinking it in a similar way to sort of the way that the Dalai Lama is sometimes seen as like this spiritual position that has a sort of diplomatic role as an intermediary, or as just like a calm, adult, mature voice in a world that seems increasingly to be going a little bit crazy and getting a little bit too childish to be run properly. But, like we've just heard, 1100 years ago, The Pope might have been some rich guy's son, the Pope might have been a noblewoman's son, the Pope might have been imprisoned or murdered or committed assassinations or led armies in the field. So the Pope is very, very different today. And when you're watching this video, we might have just had a new Pope. So congratulations, Your Holiness. I hope that you don't end up going down the Benedict the Ninth route, and I hope you end up maybe a little bit closer to the Gregory the Seventh route. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoyed that little papal interlude. If you have a favourite pope, please do let us know in the comments why it's Innocent III. And yeah, diolch yn fawr iawn yn wylio. Thank you very much for watching. Till the next time, tan y tro nesa, hwyl am y tro. Bye bye for now.